Blight by Orpheus Kidwell, Chapter 5. Outside the capital of Vale's kingdom, Naruto once more found himself at what was quickly becoming the training ground of Jujutsu, Ruby, and himself. He had found out from Ospin later that it was a forest known as Forever Fall, some time ago. Jujutsu and Ruby weren't currently with him as one was asleep and the other had classes today in Signal. Speaking of which, apparently since she had started training with the two whites, her skills had gone up and she started to garner the attention of her teachers. She was quickly rising within the ranks of Signal as some sort of late blooming prodigy. In reality, she was just adapting to their skill level and it showed in her abilities. Naruto himself was currently trying to get the hang of a particular spell. His clothing was coated in gravity dust, and he was trying to utilize it to force a rock towards him. Gravity dust itself functioned on the properties of pulling things together and pushing them away. Thus far, he found it was relatively easy for him to push things away from himself, but not pull them towards his body. But still, it wasn't like he would give up just because things were difficult. If he was that kind of person, the whites would never survive. He needed to be strong enough for his siblings. They were counting on him after all. The blonde lowers his hand as he felt a familiar signature pop into existence nearby. "Good afternoon, headmaster." Naruto greeted with a smile as he turned around up to regard the man. Ospin returned the greeting with a nod and looked around. There were stones lodged into trees, holes in the ground, and even one or two trees that had been uprooted and currently lay on the floor. "I see that you've been making progress in your arcane studies. Gravity dust is a difficult one to master, but if you continue, I do not doubt you should be able to get the hang of it. Unfortunately, I am not here to give you pointers on magic. I have some things to discuss with you in private. Thankfully, I see that you are already alone. Do you mind indulging me?" The ninth wife shrugged and motioned for him to start. "I believe that my huntsmen have started to encounter the Draugr you spoke of." "Oh, I was wondering when Orochimaru would start sending out scouting parties to find us." "If there are Draugr out, then there's also going to be specters and maybe a wraith with them to keep the Draugr in line. It looks like he's finally making his move. I wonder why he took this long." The Blanc shook his head. "Anyways, I assume you want some information. I would very much appreciate it, yes." Ospin replied as Naruto sat atop the trunk of one of the toppled trees. "While my huntsmen were able to kill these Draugr, they did something strange upon death. Oh, that's their lethe. The nether wants to disperse like a grim, but the aura wants to keep everything together. Since the nether will ultimately win, but it restrained by aura, it causes the entire corpse to explode violently and injure anything near it. It's one of the more interesting parts of the Draugr. With that said, did they encounter any Draugr with bone armor?" Osborne shook his head. "So the doctor is holding back. They've only encountered the weakest of the Draugr then. All Draugr are divided into 5 categories: Burn, Mund, Vardy, Burnder, and Riki. Weakest of the Draugr are the Burn or the Infant. They're the ones your men would have fought. All black humanoid shapes with burning red eyes and a weak aura surrounding them. These are made from civilians who have little to no experience using their aura. They also lack a semblance. These are the most common. Next in line are the Mund or Hand. These Draugr have a little bone armor, mostly spikes jutting from their back or arms, and a thin mask that covers their eyes. It looks like a domino mask, actually. Orochimaru makes these from people who have had an active aura and use it to help them in physical labor like farmers, laborers, and sailors. Very few of these ones have semblances, but sometimes they do. The Bardi or militia are halfway between quantity and quality. Bone armors. Bone armor covers their chest, back, and arms, with spikes coming from their torso and elbows usually. Their mask is also larger than the mund, usually extending to cover their forehead. On top of that, their aura is more visible. All of these have a semblance, albeit a weaker one, because they are from the defenders of settlements, from weaker mercenaries, and from tribesmen. Basically, people who use their aura in combat but aren't even academy level huntsmen yet. Next are the brander, or the blade. They are much less common than the Vardi, but also much stronger. Bone armor covers all of their upper body and usually parts of their lower body as well. While their mask covers their entire face, their aura is very visible, so much so that any part of their body that isn't covered in bone armor appears to be the color of their aura instead of black. These are the academy and graduate level huntsmen that Orochimaru got his hands on. Naruto saw that Aspe understood where the last ones were going. Lastly are the Riki, the authority. Any huntsman that Orochimaru manages to get and turn into Draugr go here, covered completely in armor. They are nearly impossible to kill with weaponry and have huntsman level semblances on top of that. There are less than a dozen of these in the complex, but I'm not sure if all the Draugr are located in the complex. I see. So they only encounter some burn if that's the case. There were no masks or armor in the description. I'm assuming the difference in power between each successive ranking is very high. Naruto nodded, which made the man sigh. This organization that created you is going to be very difficult to handle if that's the case. You said these were the failures as well? Another nod came from the white. I will certainly have to plan accordingly then. That said, there was another thing I needed from you. The blonde sat up, paying attention. I hear from my contacts over at Signal that a certain girl with silver eyes has been dramatically improving under your tutelage. I am thinking about offering her something akin to what I gave your siblings, but only if you think she's ready. The blonde couldn't help but grin. Ruby would be so excited. 3 days later, Patch. Usually Ruby would arrive in Vale early on Saturday morning, and Naruto would already be waiting for her. After a little teasing from Yang, who generally dropped the girl off, they would leave and go where they went that day. Sometimes they browsed shops and even bought something once or twice, and sometimes they went to Forever Fall to train. Usually they ate breakfast and lunch together. Depending on how late Yang stayed out, they might even eat dinner back at the White's apartment. She would leave back to Patch and then come back on Sunday, which they would always spend browsing Tuscan's book trade when he got his new shipments in. Then they'd head back to somewhere nice like the park or library, depending on what the weather was, to read what they'd purchased. Given Utakata worked there, they usually got good prices from the Faunus. However, Naruto had been worried when Yang showed up on Saturday morning to park her bike, but with no Ruby in sight. She explained to him that Ruby had developed a fever earlier that week, and it slipped Yang's mind to send him a message about it. After apologizing, she told him not to worry. However, Naruto couldn't help himself. He told her that he wanted to make sure that his friend was okay, but that she didn't need to give him a ride. After all, he knew what Ruby's aura felt like, so he should be more than capable of finding her. Yang hadn't known how to react to that statement and just watched as he flared his aura and flew off. That wasn't a metaphor. Naruto had actually changed his form to that of a rather large condor and flew off. The blonde girl might have had something to say, but she just sighed and decided to leave it be. If she did, perhaps she'd find a funny scene back home. As for Naruto, he had used one of his 6 parts of his semblance, cloak of 1,000 furs and feathers. This one allowed him to take the form of any creature he'd ever observed. It altered him on a biological level, not just changed his outward appearance. The downside was that it was very aura intensive to retain this form. Naruto felt he probably had more than enough aura to make it to Patch though. He had seen maps of it that Ruby showed him, and even had seen what her house looked like thanks to her showing him pictures of her family. With that in mind, he had used his large wings to carry him far above the clouds and found his way far, far above everything else in Vale, aside from Mount Sur, which was the tallest mountain in the White Curtain. From his vantage, he was able to glide down until he found the settlement he sought. So as to not raise the alarm of Signal Academy, the boy made sure he landed outside the village and reverted back. Of course, as was customary whenever he finished using any part of his semblance, he activated the hungry ghost who feeds and absorbed some of the surrounding stones and dirt, quickly replenishing whatever aura he lost. The complex had made him paranoid about any and everything that could go wrong. Ensuring that he had a tight rein on his nether, the White ventured forth. While Patch was relatively large island, he was sure of his step and he traveled and traversed the woods. He found himself walking over a beaten but not paved path through the thick forests. Either side of him saw large gray trees that were bare of foliage clawing the sky. The scent of snow wilderness and grim filled his nostrils, and he thought he understood why Signal might exist on this secluded island. Disregarding the packs of grim nearby in lieu of worrying over his friend, Naruto trekked forward while usually he would jump to the challenge to destroy more of the blight on this world, which were the grim. Ruby was more important at the moment. With that thought, he followed the familiar signature of her aura and the faint smell of rose petals until he found himself looking at a long cabin in the woods. If he hadn't already known this was her house, he might have been surprised, honestly. Good morning, can I help you? Naruto found himself drawn to the gravely hollow voice of another blonde. Turning to regard him, the White recognized him from the photos Ruby had shared and knew this was her father, Taiyang Xiaolong. That said, he was hardly recognizable from the lively person he remembered from her scrolls gallery. This man surely had the same blonde hair, but it was darker, as if it hadn't seen proper sunlight in ages. Blue eyes were bloodshot and were sunk in so far that he probably hadn't slept in a long time. On top of that, his skin was rather pale. Naruto knew that Ruby stated Summer's death had affected her father, but he didn't expect to meet a zombie. Oh yeah, my name is Naruto. I heard that Ruby was sick and I just wanted to make sure she was okay. Hearing the words he spoke, the blonde thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he hadn't actually thought things through before acting. Oh well, this was Ruby, so it didn't matter. As long as he could ensure that his friend was okay, then that was enough for him. Tai Yang seemed to be thinking about something before shaking his head as if it was groggy. You must be one of her friends from Signal. The door is unlocked. I'm sure she'll be happy to have you by, what with Yang rushing off. Her fever is going down, but she still can't leave her bed yet. Just don't excite her too much. Naruto nodded once at his one request. Thank you, Mr. Xiaolong. Naruto responded and made his way inside the cabin. He mostly ignored the kitchen, and then, as he made his way upstairs, he did note that the furnishing seemed to be nice. Then again, what did he know about that sort of stuff? The most he had ever had was a bed and desk. Throwing that thought away, he made his way upstairs and followed Ruby's aura until he arrived at a door with a large rose-looking emblem on it. Thinking better about barging in, he knocked. What is it, Yang? He heard from the other side. It was nasally and a bit tired, but he recognized it as Ruby's immediately. He grinned, knowing that she was okay, but as Taiyang and Yang had told him, still, he never really believed people until he observed for himself. Was that one reason that the complex gave him less missions? Oh well. Actually, it's Naruto. He replied back before hearing what sounded like a crash and something squeaking. Ruby, are you okay? When there was no response, he opened the door and saw that the girl was wearing a set of black silk pajamas with white dot designs all over it. The top buttoned all the way to her neck. She was also on the floor, the blanket of her bed wrapped around her legs, and her eyes a bit disoriented. Her usually ivory-colored skin was a light pink to show just how high her fever was. Rushing to her side, the blonde helped her to her feet. Ruby, what happened? Ow, ow, ow. She moaned as he set her back on her bed. Naruto, what are you doing here? She asked. Her voice was no longer tired, but he could still hear its nasally tone. She seemed somewhere between surprised and nervous based on her voice, though the white couldn't understand why the second was there. Oh, I was waiting for you this morning when Yang showed up and told me you were sick, he explained. Ruby looked at him, seemingly waiting for him to say something else. That's it. She told me you were sick, so I wanted to make sure you were okay. Her face brightened a few shades more than it already was. Ruby, you should lay down. I don't want your fever to get any worse. He grabbed her shoulders and gently forced her to lay down, covering her back up. I'm glad you aren't as bad as you were before, according to your dad, but I still want to make sure that you recover correctly, so I'll stay here and get you back to proper health. Naruto saw that Ruby wasn't saying anything and wondered whether her temperature actually was. Leaning forward, he pressed his forehead against hers, only to feel her rapidly heat up. Humming in thought, he frowned as he realized his work might be cut out for him. That fever was coming back with a vengeance. That said, he had been the one to help his siblings anytime they were ill. He could do this. Alright, it seems like I'll be here all day helping you, Ruby. I think I might need to borrow your kitchen for a bit, but just call me if you need something. I need to find out what ingredients you actually have so I can cook you something to get rid of those sinuses. Walking out the room, but leaving the door open, he began searching the contacts on his scroll for Yang. He was so busy he didn't notice that Ruby finally reacted to everything, and she was wearing just about the largest grin she had ever had on her face.